So we're very fortunate to have three of the preeminent leaders in the real estate industry on our panel today. We have a major private sector developer, a leading planning consultant serving both the private and public sectors, and the Westchester County Planning Commissioner. So we're looking forward to our discussion. So thank you all for participating. For a quick introductions before I turn it over to each of you for some brief comments. For those that don't know Art Collins, he's president of Collins Enterprises. His firm is a multi-generational developer of commercial and residential properties. Most of you are familiar with his successful development at Hudson Park, the apartments on the Yonkers waterfront. Art is in charge of development activities for the firm and is very active within ULI. He's also shared his expertise with the Westchester County Association in drafting the playbook, with a particular emphasis on housing and more specifically affordable housing. Thank you, Art. We also have Pat Cleary. Pat is the principal of Cleary Consulting, a professional planning firm providing services to both government and the private sector. Pat, too, has been active with us at the County Association on planning policy issues, and he has a unique perspective with a foot in both camps, working in both the public and private sectors. And then, of course, thrilled to have our commissioner, Norma Drummond. Norma has been an integral and continues to be an integral part of the Westchester County Planning Department. She oversees the department, and her expertise is most demonstrated in the community development and affordable housing programs. She was instrumental in the preparation of the 2019 Westchester County Housing Needs Assessment Report. So thank you all for joining us. With that, if I could, let me just turn it over for a few brief comments of introduction from our panelists. Art, can I start with you?
Sure, Bill, thank you very much. And thank you for, congratulations to the award winners, and proud to know you, both you guys, and you've done great things in Westchester County. Over the course of the last 30 years or so, we've really tried to focus on public-private partnerships, and we realized that essentially, given the democratic process, the way the land use boards work, and in order to get economic development and private investment back into some of the first-ring suburbs and urban areas in Westchester County, this is the public is more than involved, and we recognize that most of the properties or the villages and towns that are in Westchester, that we look for ones that like what Yonkers did in the 90s, to put together a master plan for redevelopment and economic development plan for the for the properties in the downtown. They provided financial incentives, and most importantly, the administration was pro-business. In other towns in Westchester, I'm just going to point out that the growth and the commitment to economic development has been anemic. New construction has been, especially in housing, has been less than 1% over the last 20 years. We have an aging housing stock that in many of the communities is 70% of the housing stock is well over 50 years old. And so growth has been sort of resisted in a number of places. We, as a company, has been trying to figure out exactly why. So I hope we can talk a little bit more about that and what sort of the solutions are as we move forward today.
Thanks, Art. Pat, please.
Thank you, Bill, and congratulations to everyone this morning. I just wanted to sort of reinforce some of the message that you've been hearing this morning, which is really we have in many ways lost sight of how fundamental housing is to our communities. And, you know, since human beings began to walk on two legs, our priorities have been, you know, food and shelter. And while that may have changed a little bit recently, it's shelter and perhaps, you know, high-speed internet and a good coffee shop. Housing is still at the core of what is the concern of most of our communities. And now more than ever, we're facing, you know, very dramatic paradigm shifts in the way our land use patterns have traditionally operated. But what we can rely on is the fact that residential housing is a key to all of this. And, you know, originally we sort of built our land use patterns and our zoning controls from downtowns out, from commercial areas out, from industrial areas out, and almost by default, the residential areas of the remaining areas of our communities sort of were residential. And much to our discredit, in many ways, low density, single family residential areas. So what I'm sort of trying to emphasize today is that we need to fundamentally flip the script on the way we address residential uses in our communities and build that as sort of the fundamental central core of our land use patterns. You know, the pandemic has certainly changed a lot of things. It may have put the nail in the coffin of brick and mortar retail. We go to the doctor online, we shop online, we socialize online, our children are educated remotely. All of that is occurring where? It's occurring in our homes. So the importance of our residences has become so much different than it was just 9 months ago. So what I'm suggesting is we can't just apathetically default to where we used to be in our consideration of residential use. It's everything else. It is fundamental to what we do. And I'll just give you two examples of how important that's become. And one of the examples that some of you have heard me talk about is the Platinum Mile, where over the years, the success of that area was deteriorating and we were seeing vacancies and the certs were crippling local economies. And what the town, in this case, the town of Harrison, did was through an amendment to a comprehensive plan and through some zoning amendments, opened up the opportunities and said, we're willing to consider additional uses, including residential uses. And very shortly, the residential developers showed up and said, trust us, we think we can build this in an area you never thought it was possible before. And that would support what else is going on. And what we have seen, the proof's in the pudding. Toll Brothers, Trammell Crow Residential, nearly 1,000 units of new residential use has been built in areas that were formerly commercial. That has allowed additional ancillary uses to come into those areas, Lifetime Fitness, the Wegmans supermarket that many of you have heard about. And the remaining office buildings now are fully tenanted because the supply has been, matches the demand. So residential use literally drives the businesses that Bill Mooney talked about earlier. There's no doubt about it. And one other quick example I'll give you is the North 60. And I'm sure Norma will talk about that in a minute, but the county negotiated a lease with a developer to build a 3 million square foot biotech community, about to go through the entitlement process, and then came back to the county and said, wait a minute, we forgot residential. Can we renegotiate the lease? Because this won't work unless there's a residential component that supports the use. So what I'm simply saying today is that housing is so important. One size fits all does not work. We need to have a very diverse housing pattern that addresses affordability, all segments of the community, and that's essential to creating the kinds of communities that will be successful in the future, particularly in this time of uncertainty. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Pat. Commissioner, please.
So good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Congratulations to our awardees. Mayor Roach and the City of White Plains certainly deserve it, and John Nolan certainly. It's amazing what you've been able to accomplish over the many, many years. The County Planning Department is obviously responsible for working on the orderly growth of Westchester County, which means we need to certainly take a look at our history at where we've been. Our most recent effort has been finishing up Census 2020, which was a tremendous and unique challenge for all of us. And so now we're bringing our focus back to housing once again, and continuing to roll out the housing needs assessment that Bill Cuddy mentioned that the county executive did introduce last year. But I do want to just segue just a little bit to under the leadership of County Executive George Latimer, there's been much more of a focus here in the County Planning Department about assisting our local municipalities and recognizing the integral role they play in how our businesses and our economy really grows. There's no question that jobs follow the housing. okay? And strong economies in our local municipalities are going to go where the jobs are, and young people are going to go where the jobs are and where the housing is. So it certainly is important. Through our county planning board, we provide advice to local municipalities as they study many, many local developments that come their way, giving them thoughts about things they may not have seen, but we might see on a more regional basis. And certainly then also protecting, making sure we're watching out for the other local municipalities and for other, important structures and streams and other things as well. So we don't want to lose sight of that. But, I'll pick up on just what Pat Cleary mentioned about the North 60. We were very excited about having the developer move forward with that. But in studying across the country what successful biotechnology campuses look like, we did see that many of them were surrounded by housing. And so as this development is working its way through its local approvals, again, we're working with the town and working with the local developer about how to make sure we can make sure that the campus itself is going to be successful by including all of the components that it needs to get there. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Great. Commissioner, thank you. And appreciate the comments of all of our panelists. One of the topics that you've touched on, and maybe just revisit as a follow-up question, would be this integration of multiple uses, inclusive of residential. And we've talked about diversity of incomes. We've talked about range of economic impacts. But for property development, how do you see this integration of multiple uses that would include residential?
So the idea of living over the store has existed, since we've been building buildings with second stories. And there's no question that making housing close to where people live is certainly integral and important. One of the things that came out of the housing needs assessment that was pretty shocking to most people was the fact that there are so many more people who live outside of Westchester and commute in, and so many more people that are commuting out of Westchester to go to work than the people who live and work in Westchester. There's about 172,000 people who live and work in Westchester, but there are 200,000 people who are commuting out and another 200,000 people who are commuting in. And so when you've got so many people that are making those daily commutes, it's hours that they're losing on quality of life, but it's also putting a strain on our transit system and the highways and the public transportation as well. So we really need to look at more ways and that we can incorporate housing into a lot of the developments. We've seen it along 287, where it's really starting to show how these old office campuses that used to be just businesses are now being redeveloped to incorporate housing mixed right in with so many of the other uses that are important to people on an everyday basis. So I'm sure that kind of redevelopment across Westchester is going to continue.
And Bill, I just offer a word of caution. Norma mentioned it. Living over the store has been traditional, but today the store's not there anymore. So you're living over something. So the ability to have multiple uses is now more than ever, even more important. So we're placemaking the lower level, and above it is residences. I don't know what's in the lower level anymore. It's not the store, but we're still making places. So we need to accommodate multiple uses.
Great. Thank you. And I asked this question not to dehumanize the workforce, but in terms of the comments that we've heard, would you consider housing as infrastructure for our businesses and institutions?
When we think of infrastructure, it's quite more encompassing than most people think of. It is definitely public transportation. It is water and sewer and electric and gas and all of the utilities that we also think of. But yes, it's also housing. The businesses that look to move to Westchester, one of the first questions they ask is, where are our employees going to live? And when you say, well, they're going to come maybe from Rockland County and Dutchess County and the Bronx, that's not the reason that they're going to come to Westchester. They're going to come to Westchester because we've got such a high quality of life here. We've got highly educated people here. And so housing is a very definite infrastructure resource for those businesses looking to move here.
Thank you. I just did at CBRE, we have a labor analytics group. And as they do work for corporations and institutions, access to skilled labor, both present and in the future for growing those businesses, is the number one key issue. So we think of it as infrastructure as well. Maybe more specifically ask a question when we talk about the range of quote unquote affordable housing. Pat, can you share some distinctions as it relates to an affordable tax credit deal versus a market rate apartment that might have some percentage of affordable units?
Bill, that's a good question. And I think Art probably can answer that better than I can. But what I think is underlying that question is the sort of policy thought of, is it appropriate to allow Art to go out and figure out how he's going to fund an affordable housing project and cobble together the tools that are necessary to make it happen? Or does the municipality impose a program where all of that is sort of given to the developer? And I think that's a sort of a fundamental underlying question to that, which is, who's in charge? Is it the local municipality that devises the system entirely, or is it left to the developer to figure out how to achieve that goal of providing affordability?
So Pat, the distinction, if I'm hearing you, is also one is an imposed regulatory requirement, and the other is more of a private sector initiative to harness the tax credit.
That's exactly right, Bill. And many of those programs come from government, but nevertheless, it's up to the developer to decide which of those they would deploy to achieve an economically viable project.
Mm-hmm. Great. Norma, if I may, Art, any comment on that? Because you from the private sector.
Right. Well, the concern that comes from our side of it is that much of what was just talked about is not really understood by the land use boards and by some of the elected officials. I mean, not all of them. I mean, I think Mayor Roach is very familiar with how to get these deals structured, but they are complicated. There is, the land use boards do require and ask for a lot from the private sector to basically build a project, and continually challenging us with density, with assessments and fees that will go back to the municipality, that just undermine or the financing or the financial aspects of the private investment that we're coming to do in their village or their town. It's concerning to me. It's concerning. I have a solution, but essentially, we talked a little bit about trying to, over time, bring in a sort of a third-party financial resource and authority that potentially could help underwrite and talk a little bit about what the density for affordable housing should be, whether it's private, whether it's tax credit driven, et cetera, and give people real education about how best to accomplish what their needs are. But we need to start with a master plan. What is the village of X want in terms of affordable housing? Do they want mixed income? Because we become the whipping post, in front of the public and the land use boards, which are and the land use meetings, with the public making comment. So it's the other thing that I think is unfortunate for us, especially too, is that the uncertainty of where we're going, where we're going to end up, and the time it takes to get there. Given all the hard work that WCA has done with the playbook, what the county's done with the housing assessment needs and so forth, it just seems to me that there's real clarity there, and yet it's not really filtering down, in my opinion, to some of the villages and towns. That needs to happen to get the growth.
So, or let's dig in on that point a little bit, because we know the secret process requires environmental impact statements. Are you suggesting that an independent resource third party should also provide a pro forma assessment of a project's impacts?
Right. Well, we've talked to Bridget Gibbons quite a bit about this, and I think it's her idea that actually to bring in some third party to verify and endorse the numbers, let's say that a developer or private investment investor wants to invest in their town. I'm sure that Mr. Gertler up in Utica was looking pretty hard at their numbers for their generation plant up there. But here, I think we can do the same thing. I mean, essentially, these applications in all these towns have now become site plan approvals, where there is a fair amount of discretion by the land use boards and the elected officials about what should be done. And there's a tremendous amount of public input. So they're basically a public job. I mean, it's a public project. They want to know, what color shirt I wore last Wednesday. I mean, this is how detailed these projects are getting. And it's almost, well, it is actually, there's a political aspect of it as well, which is at times somewhat uncertain. That's why I'm thinking if we could get some kind of a third party, maybe, and we were hoping that maybe WCA or an impartial group that can actually have some authority and to get the housing and mixed income and affordable housing that the county needs to weigh in on some of these applications in some form or another, that would go a long way.
Well, like they say, Art, the truth sets us free. More transparency and disclosure around the cost and the burdens also that are imposed on developers, whatever those might be, sewer connections, recreation fees, et cetera. I think should be part and parcel to the understanding what a developer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Let me go back just for a moment, if I may, and Norma, this might be one for you, but for anybody in the panel. There are a lot of perceptions, misperceptions about affordable housing, like it diminishes the value of a neighborhood, it adversely impacts schools, it can overburden services. Are these true or false? And could you shed some light on some of these often characterized comments?
So I actually did an internet search to just kind of prepare for if a question came up about property values or something like that. And I actually found that there are studies going back for over 20 years where they have looked at the impacts on nearby residential properties about affordable housing. And so for 20 years, they've been saying that there is very, very little impact, if any. In fact, I would challenge some of our municipalities to just tell us that the 14 townhomes that we built in an underutilized park in Briarcliff had quite a positive impact on North State Road in Briarcliff. The 65 rental units that we built up in the town of North Salem was a very positive impact because the developments, when they get finished, are totally within the character of what's already in that community. And so they fit in and they become integral to, the folks that live there, work there in many, many cases, or work nearby. They work in the schools and they work in the other businesses that are local to the area. So the misperception that, affordable housing becomes a burden really, really is not true. It has changed so much. It's not the old public housing standards that we have. That we've seen, that a lot of the public housing that was built in the 40s, we're rebuilding those developments, as even Mayor Roach commented on. Winbrook is now becoming Brookfield Commons, and we're rebuilding those, institutional looking buildings to much more garden style apartments, and where we have much more of an appearance and a proximity to the street frontage there, so that the residents become more integral again to the local communities.
And Bill, I think if you can think of a lot of the ordinances that have been adopted or the way a lot of municipalities impose their affordable housing criteria, it is not to it, and it's designed to avoid this issue of stigma, so that there are requirements that these uses are integrated into a building so that you can't determine which door is the door to the affordable unit in the multi-unit building or not. So I think there's been a great deal of sensitivity paid by approving agencies to the potential of what might have been viewed as stigma, which would then relate to affordability or you know, the prices of housing surrounding them. So I don't see it as an issue at all, Bill, and I think it's been handled very, very well by all of the approving agencies.
And Pat, I can appreciate that the professionals in the approving agencies understand that. I think we probably all need a better job to educate and advocate in the public, which drives a lot of this sentiment and this misunderstanding. But you talked about, Pat, this housing. Let me throw you a bit of a hot potato. The County Association's Real Estate Task Force has been thinking of a model regulation to help drive the creation of more affordable housing, and is advocating that multifamily developments should have 20% as an affordable quotient, significantly more than what's now a regulatory requirement in Westchester's municipalities. But that those 20% of units need to be on top of the baseline that would otherwise have been approved. Yeah. And that the municipality needs to have economic development incentives to essentially underwrite the creation of those affordable units. How do you the panel feel about that proposition? So
I think one size does not fit all, Bill. That's important to bear in mind. So a rigorous standard that might apply in one community may not be appropriate in another community. And Norma mentioned it early what the county did, and I think every municipality should do the same thing: a housing needs assessment to understand, to take stock of what you have and what you need to do. So the notion of adding a provision to require is based on the need of a community. And I'll just point out that some recent zoning that the city of Mount Vernon is putting in place today includes a market rate minimum requirement, not an affordable, the other way around, because they believe they have enough affordable housing in the community. So they've imposed a regulatory requirement to require market rate housing, where typically they would get affordable housing. So that certainly doesn't apply to another community that might not have enough affordable housing. So I think you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. And the tool that's useful to deal with that is the housing needs assessment.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the Westchester County chapter, playbook chapter on housing advocates that municipalities undertake that housing initiative. And Norma, you touched on this, and maybe we can dive in a little further. That does require political leadership and public support, but also resources and funding. How do we better capture the resources and funding solution?
Well, I think that in terms of, let me start by talking about the housing needs assessment for a little bit. This is the third housing needs assessment that the county has done. And this one is actually quite unique from the previous ones in that as we look at the housing needs and all of the demographic and all the housing stock data that's in there, we didn't just get the county-wide numbers this time around, but we got the numbers for each and every local municipality. And now I'm going around and talking to each of the local municipalities, including their municipal boards and their elected boards, about their own story about affordable housing, because many of them don't have the ability to undertake a study of their own, to get that housing data that's local, specific to them. What's the median sale price of a house in their local community? What's the income of the owners in their community? What's the income of the renters and what that rent is? So by the county undertaking some of these initiatives and some of these reports for the local municipalities, and then undertaking initiatives like creating model ordinances for the local municipalities to consider adopting, where we rolled out accessory dwelling units last year for them to look at. And this year we're going to roll out a senior housing model ordinance. I think we help the local municipalities that it saves some of their resources by having done so much of the research for them and giving them real models that they can take and then locally adopt as it works within their own local community, because resources are tight all over the place. So it's important for us to be able to give guidance and help as much as we can to our local municipalities.
And Bill,
sorry, please, Pat.
Just touch on that, Bill, just to say, again, as Norma's alluding to, it varies depending on the community you're in, but Art referenced the challenge of the public participation process in the land use process. A community that assumes it will address affordability by giving a developer a bonus, for example, may be viewed very negatively to the community. You're increasing density, that's a negative thing, as opposed to relying on tax credits or IDA funding or a pilot program. So again, it depends on the community and the technique that gets utilized in each particular community.
Yeah, thank you. Just for sheer numbers, if Westchester County is delivering on average 2,500 units, apartment units a year, if an additional 20% were in this category, that would be 500 units a year. That would be a tsunami level change in the delivery of affordable housing. I just want to put some numbers to the market. If we want to move it, that's maybe where we need to go. One of the things that comes up again in conversations often is IDA and pilot programs. And again, misperceptions or mischaracterizations about it. Could I ask the panel to maybe share some thoughts on pilots?
Sure. Bill, that's interesting that you bring that up, because what we're finding is that that there are some places where we're trying to do business in Westchester and trying to be able to finance the imposed assessments and fees that the municipality has put on us, and also the challenge of what Pat was talking about with density. Because density is, in fact, in the right places, is the cure to getting affordable housing and mixed income and more diverse housing across the county. But a lot of these fees and a lot of these impositions by the municipalities on the developer and the private investment undermine the financeability of the project, meaning that many of them have to go back to the IDA to try and get tax benefits over time, especially pilots and payment in lieu of taxes, sales and mortgage recording tax exemptions, et cetera, just to make the project viable. And so it's a multi-layered kind of effort, all of which is, I'm not saying it's a public process, but it's a process where you have to be approved and induced by an IDA to get it done. So there's a significant amount of uncertainty to just get to the point where we're trying to actually build, let's say, on a derelict vacant site in Westchester and try to provide some affordable housing. And it's an uphill battle just because of those two things. So we appreciate having the IDA working alongside of us, but in many cases, the municipality has to approve the benefit before the IDA is going to take control over awarding those benefits to a private investor and developer. That's the reality.
Art, how difficult is it to underwrite and secure debt in the absence of a pilot?
Well, in most cases, it's pretty tough because until recently, construction costs have been going in the wrong direction, up. Until recently, we've had to negotiate labor contracts, open shop versus union jobs and so forth, depending. And I think that there's a distinction, and everybody's got to make the distinction about construction type, because up to 60 feet, you can build in wood. Above that, it's either it's steel and concrete. It's a lot more expensive. it's hard to do without some kind of benefits. We talked about Yonkers early on in the panel discussion. Without the brownfield credits, without state relief on sales, real estate taxes, mortgage recording tax exemptions, et cetera, those deals were not feasible to do. And also the city was willing to be flexible with payment for the land. So I've heard a lot of my fellow developers who stand up and say, well, without free land and no taxes, these deals can't be built. And early on in the early 2000s, when New Rochelle started to really get going, that was the case with the Avalon Bay when they were building those buildings. So it's not an easy path, and that's why I say the more I can educate the land use boards, the elected officials, the planning staff, whoever, on how these numbers work, and I'm happy to show it to them, they'll see that that there's an imposition. And one more thing, Bill, I'll say that there's been a few municipalities that we've gotten involved in Westchester who have approved deals over the last 4 or 5 years after changing the zoning to accept mixed use and housing and so forth. And none of these projects have actually gone forward. And that just points to the fact that there's maybe a little bit too much strain on the developers to get it financed, primarily because of some of the stresses I mentioned about assessments and fees.
And let me dive a little deeper on pilots, because it's like Pat's earlier comment. There's no one size fits all for municipalities. Pilots can have a range of components. Maybe speak to term and conditions and
yeah. Well, initially, 10 or 15 years ago, we were able to negotiate a pilot agreement, and it was backed by the state in something related to a qualified employment zone, and you had to be in part of a district, and that was a 16-year, essentially a tax relief. 10 years of no taxes, and then it phases in over the next 6. Today, I think the IDA is probably not willing as much to put 20 years on the term, but with the sales tax and also the burden of municipalities with additional capital costs that they have to fund. I know in Pelham, as an example, they did a bond issue recently with building a new school. So why wouldn't municipalities like that encourage new construction, density where it makes sense, and award these pilots to incentivize the developer and private investor to move forward.
Pat, you have some experience on being in both camps on this pilot.
So it's an interesting conversation, Bill, and I think this one goes, I'm trying to find the underlying components to all of these questions, which is a developer comes into a community and says, I need something in order to make this happen. So at what point does the community have an obligation to say to Art, prove it to us, show us your books, prove that the profit you'll make is supportable. If it's too much, we're not going to give you incentives. If it's too much, we're not going to encourage some sort of pilot program or whatever it might be. So that's kind of an 800-pound gorilla in the room when we think about how we review these sorts of projects. At what point do we call the developer to task, and what's the obligation a municipality has to sort of say, show us the bottom line, and why should we help you? So that's, I think, an interesting question.
Yeah. Well, it feels like with that as the linkage, we're back to the transparency and the financial pro forma disclosure.
Right.
Great, thank you. So I know we're closing in, and we are at 11. We want to welcome questions. We have some that have lined up, but since we're coming to a conclusion, if anybody does have questions, please use the feature in the Zoom, and we'll do our best to address them. We've had two questions that are somewhat related regarding what are the changes or issues in a COVID pandemic environment as it relates to multifamily and creating density, in TOD locations.
Yeah, it's a real bad time to be a planner, Bill. Like, what's the future hold? I don't know. It's a good question, though. And I think, as I said in my remarks to begin with, the one thing that is certain is the need for housing. So I think in planning for housing appropriately and the efforts to create housing in the appropriate locations where density can be supported, TOD, that continues. There's that I think we can rely on. But as for where else everything's going, your guess is as good as mine. Probably better, Bill.
Well, it might be an interesting mix of both planning and architectural design in grappling with a lot of those issues. I know that in the commercial office sector, that's what we're working through.
Yeah, I keep using the phrase placemaking. And again, I'm not sure what's going into the boxes, but the boxes have to look great. They have to create a vibrancy and so forth. And whether that's an office building or a downtown, we as planners, we as professionals can still make those places special places.
A question for you, Art, from the private sector, and I know speaking for Collins, but what do you think, Collins, and generally, if you might assess the willingness of developers to be more forthcoming in their financial performance?
Okay, well, we have no problem doing that. And we have done that in numerous cities and towns over time. And many of my fellow developers want to keep a lot of that confidential. What we're finding is that, as I said before, this is a public process. I mean, the people that are showing up and making comments can say anything they want to and find out anything they want to about our project. I think that it all boils down to what the economic imperative is for the county is to basically develop more mixed income housing, housing that's affordable as well as affordable housing. And if that takes us to show whatever municipality or land use board or whatever, what those numbers look like, we'll jump on that and we'll do that. Relative to how COVID is affecting us, I mean, we are still in New York is unique in this way that there's a tremendous amount of derelict land that aligns these transit stops up and down the west coast, the west side of the Westchester, and even in Connecticut too. Massive parking lots, all underutilized land that can be appropriate for affordable and mixed income housing. And some of the towns are actually starting to adopt that. And I believe that we need to, like Norma was saying, show these towns and promote it around to the public that how these projects are actually helping with their tax base, with the mix of housing and giving people senior housing as an example. And we're actually designing for the COVID, for there's going to be more home offices and so forth. And we're designing multifamily units to accommodate that. So it's not that big a deal doing it around the country.
Or we've had a question on financing too. Do buildings that have an affordable unit percentage, are there financing issues or benefits when there are affordable? For instance, would a commercial lender be more agreeable or receptive for debt financing if there are affordable units, since it may serve to support CRA, community reinvestment requirements?
Yeah, I think that's the only place that we find there's an advantage. If the bank or the institution can qualify it as community redevelopment funds and so forth. Generally speaking, the affordable, especially if there's 60 or so percent AMI affordable units, it's basically a giveaway. We have to build it, but we're not going to get really any return from it.
We had another question on SECRA. How malleable it is. As we've talked about, a financial pro forma or other issues. Maybe this goes to you, Pat. I don't think the law is going to disappear, but how much flexibility is there for a municipality to work within the regulatory framework?
So SECRA is an interesting topic, Bill, and it sometimes is a wonderful asset, sometimes it's used as a foil. The one thing that John Nolan mentioned earlier, the ability when you are focusing on a broader policy approach, the provision of smart growth, mixed use, affordable housing in a transit-oriented format, the opportunity to do a generic environmental impact statement for the community to set the stage by a sort of clearing all the environmental hurdles for a developer is an enormous incentive, I think. And not only from the municipality's perspective is it beneficial because it calms the mind in terms of the potential opposition, because the community understands generically that a certain level of development is acceptable. And from ART's perspective in the development community, they know there's a threshold within which if they can stay below it, they're good to go. So I think from a SECRA perspective, the GEIS is a wonderful tool. It's evidenced in New Rochelle. Mount Vernon West did it as well. It's a great tool. But the regular EIS, project by project EIS, always a challenge.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to ask you all for some final comments, but there was an interesting question we got where multifamily can tap into stormwater and sewer and other infrastructure in the TOD locations. It becomes much more difficult, if not impossible, in more rural, septic, undeveloped communities. Any creative solutions or thoughts in development in those areas?
I'll just chime in, Bill. I think that has nothing to do with affordability. That's just about density. So if an area can't support a certain level of density, then it's an unsuitable location to add more units, whether they're affordable or not. So that's, I think, a fundamental question with respect to any type of development.
Great, thank you. So we are past our time, but thank you, everybody. In closing, Commissioner, can I impose on you for any closing remarks? And again, if you had a magic wand or some, words of wisdom for us, we'd love to hear it.
So I think I'm going to quote you, actually. The problem is not intractable. It's not insurmountable. Okay. We put that quote in when I start my discussion with the housing needs assessment as I go around to the different municipalities. Housing is essential. There's no question, and the jobs follow the housing. It's really critical for Westchester to be able to encourage our young kids to stay here if they get good jobs and they find opportunities that match with the skills that they're learning in school these days that were not really what we were learning years ago. So we need such a diversity in our housing stock, not just the single family homes. We really need to see housing thought of differently these days. I've seen one developer who has thought about how do you build COVID type housing where every bedroom has its own bathroom, because you've got certain circumstances now that you just didn't have to worry about in the past. So, it's still a very vibrant industry that we're still learning from how what we've done in the past and how we can change it moving forward to meet the challenges and the needs that we still have facing. But the jobs follow the housing. There's just no question to it. It's the integrity and the tying together of economic development and housing is really critical.
Thank you. Arthur.
Yes. Well, I was looking at one of the questions about diversity, and I think it's a really valid sort of concept, especially as it relates to housing and mixed use. I think that we have been we can learn a lot from other projects around the country and around the world, and trying to create diversity and different housing types, mixed income, and so forth. And that's one of the fun things about and the challenge about being a developer and private investor, to come up with new ideas and sort of create a new, kind of a new mousetrap. And that's why sometimes we're just a little bit concerned about how we're still looking at things as they were maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I'd like to see us, really expand out. And I think the work that Norma and Pat are doing around the county are eventually going to hopefully seep in, and especially those places that really do need more diversity in housing, diversity in the population, but diversity in housing and so forth. That's the way to get it.
Thank you. Patrick.
And Bill, just to sort of touch on the profession, it is our comprehensive planning that sort of sets the stage for where we're going. And there's nothing wrong with admitting our mistakes. So as Professor Nolan indicated, during the second half of the 20th century, there were 3 innovative housing techniques that were employed. There were tens of thousands of projects that went through the process that were single family homes on large lots, the same old thing. That was a mistake. We can recognize that as a mistake. And the reluctance to change, to go back and visit a comprehensive plan that was built on the foundation of assumptions from the latter part of the 20th century and change it today to reflect the reality of the current conditions is what we must do. We've got to fess up. So everything Art Norman says is absolutely true. And we as communities need to come to the table and say, we made mistakes in the past, we can fix them now. And housing, as everybody is saying, is driving business. So that's where we need to go.
Great. Well, a heartfelt thanks, Commissioner, Art, Pat. Really appreciate your participation today. Time is running precious, I'm sure. So thank you very much. And I'd like to turn it back to my good friend, Bill Moon.
Thanks, Billy. And first of all, housekeeping, this will be made available on the WCA's website, today's presentation, if anybody wants. Thank you to Bill Cuddy, to Art, to Norma, to Pat. Very well done. Thank you for being so open and forthright with us. And thanks to all of you for spending your time with us today. Back when I was the Director of Economic Development in Westchester County, a former planning commissioner had a great line I like to use. When people ask me, is there really opportunity in Westchester? And the answer is yes, for the willing, for the willing. And we heard that quite a bit from our panelists today. Again, we made a concerted effort to make sure this was from all sides of the conversation. Let's go back to Pat's comment about, or question about who is in charge, the municipality or the developer. Well, if we both want it, if you want housing for the community, if you want benefits to the tax base in your community, you want an economically viable project, and you want a place for people to live to fill those jobs that we have, it should be both. We both. So this is an ongoing discussion. So we ask you to please help us keep this conversation going and not have this discussion or these tools sit on the shelf. Let's continue to educate each other. And remember how we started this. The inability to address housing concerns in our community is a critical issue towards the sustainability of business in our community. So let's continue to work together to make sure we continue the sustainability of our businesses and our community. So thank you again for everyone for joining us as the holiday season begin to be upon us. I hope you and all your loved ones and families stay safe and well. And if you haven't done so, don't forget to vote. Thank you very much for everybody for being here.